Good evening. Good evening and hello. Welcome to our joint Facebook Live on verbal dyspraxia and learning. I think we are both very excited to be here with you this evening, and also a little bit nervous maybe that it's all going to go to plan, fingers crossed. So it is with Hannah Morris, Educational Psychologist. Hi Hannah.
Hello.
And I'm Karen Massey and I am a speech therapist. We are live now. It's just a couple of minutes after 9, so apologies if you've been waiting. So I'm Karen and I am a speech and language therapist. I work both in the NHS in special education and also privately, and I'm here tonight with my private hat on. I enjoy supporting children with a range of complex needs, including autism, Down syndrome, verbal dyspraxia, and children with oral motor difficulties or oral placement difficulties. I've got a particular interest in severe speech disorders and pre-verbal communication.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. If you've just joined in, please make yourself comfortable, get a drink if you need. We're just introducing ourselves and then we're going to get right stuck into talking about verbal dyspraxia and learning. So Karen, thank you, has just introduced herself. I'm Hannah Morris, an educational psychologist. So I support children to know their strengths and why they might find some things difficult at school, whether it's behaviour, learning, social skills. And then I advise families and schools on what they can do to help children to make progress with their learning and development. My practice is very much based on the principle of understanding, because I do believe that you have to really understand a child, both what's working for them, the difficulties they have, and how they see the world, to know how to help them. I'm a fully independent educational psychologist. And I work with all sorts of children with all sorts of needs from the ages of 3 to 16. So this evening we are going to talk about verbal dyspraxia and learning. We're going to talk about what that is, how verbal dyspraxia affects children with their learning and development, and then we're also going to give you some ideas of what you can do to help children with their learning at home, but also addressing any issues they may have at school. So I think I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to start us off.
Okay, so what exactly is verbal dyspraxia? I'm sure there'll be a fair few of you joining us this evening or catching up on replay who will know a lot about verbal dyspraxia, and perhaps that's why you're tuning in. I know there are lots of parents who have a child with verbal dyspraxia and therefore will obviously know a lot about how verbal dyspraxia presents in their own child. But for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with the condition, it's a neurological condition and it affects the coordination of the mouth muscles for speech. And what's important about verbal dyspraxia is that the muscles themselves are actually not weak, they're strong enough and they work for other functions, but it's the coordination of the muscles that goes wrong in verbal dyspraxia. Verbal dyspraxia is also known as childhood apraxia of speech, but both terms, so childhood apraxia of speech or CAS and verbal dyspraxia or developmental verbal dyspraxia, both terms actually describe the same condition. It just often depends on which country you're in, which term is most popular. Having said that verbal dyspraxia doesn't have any muscle weakness and it's only about coordination, often it doesn't occur by itself. So it can co-occur with an oral dyspraxia, which doesn't just affect speech, but it also affects the mouth movements for other oral functions. So perhaps a child is unable to coordinate to blow out candles on their birthday cake or blow bubbles, and may really struggle to copy different mouth movements when asked, or to stick out their tongue, for example. It can also occur with a dysarthria, which is the muscle weakness. So you can have muscle weakness and muscle coordination difficulties at the same time. It can also occur alongside a more generalised dyspraxia, which affects motor parts of the whole body, so affect affecting perhaps things like writing or other gross motor skills in the limbs, and it can also occur alongside other developmental difficulties. And what's important for us to stress is that a verbal dyspraxia can be found in children with all levels of intelligence. So having a verbal dyspraxia is not saying something about how well a child is able to learn. And in the context of tonight's live, I think that's something that we felt was important to mention. Okay, so I'm going to ask Hannah at any point, Hannah, if you want to kind of join in on these next couple of slides. But we're going to think about how it affects children at school. And actually, a lot of the things in this slide and the next slide are things we kind of put the feelers out amongst parents who have children with verbal dyspraxia, and we actually asked this question, how does verbal dyspraxia affect your child's learning? And thank you if you were with us on the live and you were somebody who did respond. It was really, really helpful for us to have those responses. And what I think was really interesting is everything we're listing on these slides is actually the things that Hannah sees in her practice as an educational psychologist. And I was particularly drawn to one response which said, well, because of verbal dyspraxia doesn't affect your intelligence, actually it shouldn't affect your learning. And that was really interesting. But I think from the vast majority of responses, what was also apparent is that a lot of the time when a child has verbal dyspraxia, it's not in isolation. So they do have one of those co-occurring difficulties. I think dyslexia is something that may also co-occur that we didn't list earlier. And perhaps it's some of those other difficulties that are also causing these problems with learning.
We're definitely going to be covering a lot, and there may be some things here that people may be surprised to hear that children with verbal dyspraxia may struggle with at school. What I'd like to say is that if you've got any questions, do post them in the comments. We will try and answer them live, but if we can't, we will still comment afterwards. So there's a lot of information, and we're really looking forward to sharing it with you. But because there's so much, if you feel you haven't quite got to grips with something, do post a question, and we'll do our best to answer it.
Absolutely, thank you, Hannah. So here are just some of the areas of learning which can be affected. So the top one I think was the most popular in terms of parent responses, and probably isn't particularly surprising, is literacy. So if you've got quite significant difficulties with your speech and it's very unintelligible, you find it difficult to form words correctly, sequencing all the sounds in the right order, it's going to affect your reading, and particularly reading out loud, because you're not storing words in the same way. It's going to affect spelling, because of course if you're saying a word out loud and it doesn't sound right, then you're going to spell how it sounds when you speak. And it can also affect writing. Writing of single words, but also writing into sentences, because it's linked to that difficulty with coordination. And if you're speaking in a sentence and you're not able to put in all the smaller words, your writing might not be as complete as another child with a similar level of learning ability. Moving on, it can affect memory. I don't know if you want to pick up on this one, Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, two of the main memory issues that it's quite common in a lot of children who have any specific learning difficulty, but particularly for children with verbal dyspraxia. One is working memory, so the ability to hold information in your mind is a real difficulty, but also verbal recall, so being able to find those words and remember what you want to say. You can often see the frustration in a child's face when they know what they want to say, but they just can't quite get it out, either because they can't find the word, or maybe then they find the word and then they can't get it out in terms of pronouncing it. And when we're learning in a classroom, obviously we have to hold lots of information in our mind all the time, and it can be a real struggle. Just adding on to what you were saying about the reading, spelling and writing, what I find quite interesting is that a lot of people, if you say the word literacy, they will think reading and spelling, but actually literacy is our ability to understand language, and it's how we the way we use language skills when we are speaking, listening, reading and writing. So language is integral for literacy. So if a child has any kind of language issues, they are going to struggle with literacy as well.
Okay, so we've got next up we've got lateral thinking. Being able to kind of think not just kind of in a linear way, so making links between ideas, and if you are finding it difficult to think verbally and kind of hear your speech, it can be difficult to also coordinate your ideas. And also,
I was going to say, just to make links as well between categorising words by their meaning, what we call semantics. So, for example, knowing that pear, apple and banana are all types of fruit. And so being able to make those connections, categorise and link together can be a difficulty. And then it can have a knock-on effect as well with problem solving and being able to take a different perspective as well. So it all kind of comes into play, which obviously affects learning, but also social interactions at school.
Absolutely. So the learning style may be quite different. So a child may learn much better visually using visual information. That's easy for them to process. And maybe quite a kinesthetic learner, so they might need to kind of feel how things are rather than just learning through listening. And obviously through oral output, because their speech is going to be affected. And the next point, independence over communication. So this is something that I see a lot, not just in children with verbal dyspraxia, but with all different speech, language and communication difficulties, is that if you find communication difficult, or your efforts are not always very successful, you're quite likely to compensate by developing your independent skills instead. And independent skills are really important. But what you can find is that a child will realise that they can get something and they can achieve something by simply doing it by themselves and avoiding that communication or interaction altogether. And therefore then they start to lose those opportunities for communication, which actually they really need. So independence versus communication is something that I do see a lot.
And another aspect of independence as well, when you get into schools, is that you can sometimes find children develop learned helplessness. So sort of almost the opposite, really. But perhaps they're very reliant on an adult to enable them to access the curriculum and to sometimes even communicate for them. So unless that adult is very skilled in the way they're able to support the child while still maintaining enough distance to allow them to develop their independence, it can be problematic. And actually, we learn through making mistakes. So if a child isn't able to be independent when they're learning at times, then they lose those opportunities to develop risks as a learner and to as I say, to learn through their mistakes.
Absolutely. And the next one is language involved in non-verbal activities. And I think this is an interesting one, because we often think about language in literacy, and like I said, that came up at the top. It's quite an obvious one, and social situations. But subjects like maths, yes, they may start off with just needing to recognise your numbers, and kind of other practical activities. But actually, as maths moves on, we need to be able to understand the language behind it.
Yeah.
And as Hannah said, if there are links with semantics, then actually storing the vocabulary, that can be quite tricky.
Yeah. I mean, maths, so much of maths is about understanding what the terms mean and what the words mean. And in some respects, an element of maths is like learning a foreign language. So if a child has difficulty with language, then it does have a knock-on effect with maths. I mean, thinking about like word problems, for example, but just understanding concepts as well, like more and less. If you don't understand what those words mean, then you're going to struggle.
And then a final one on this slide, friendships and social skills. Because unfortunately, if you're really struggling with your speech, you're going to come up against more and more unsuccessful interactions with others. And at first, when children are much younger, there isn't such an emphasis on speech and language, and you can get by with friendships and social situations without speech. Games like chase in the playground. But then actually language does come in into friendships and social, and other children start to also notice when children in their class are not as able with their speech, and that can affect the friendship as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can get a lot of misunderstandings at playtime, but also in the classroom as well. We can have children who are a bit shy and then they don't want to speak out in front of the class. And actually, although some children do have additional neurodevelopmental issues such as autism or ADHD, even if there's no autism and it's just verbal dyspraxia, social skills development is still affected, because when a child has lack of experience to use their communication skills, then they struggle to learn to be able to take the social perspective of another person. And also another issue that's quite common is being able to adjust the content and the way that a child speaks to different people in different situations. So, for example, knowing how to speak to a teacher compared to how to speak to a friend. So this all has an impact. And also what we find sometimes is that if there are issues going on in the playground, this probably builds into what we're going to talk about a bit more coming up about the emotional issues, but when those are not resolved, then you go back into the classroom and then it has a knock-on effect on the learning as well. So there's a lot going on that children with verbal dyspraxia have to try to deal with in school.
Absolutely. So I mentioned organisation, so within the verbal dyspraxia, so just in terms of speech, often there's a real difficulty in organising the sounds involved in a word and then sequencing them to say a word clearly. But I often see that organisation and difficulty with sequencing in other situations. So often it will start to affect their language as well, and thoughts and ideas. So being able to, we can use, for example, organising all the different events that have happened, the kind of images in the brain, and then being able to sequence them can be a really challenging task. Often children with verbal dyspraxia will require longer processing time. So when they're given an instruction, having extra time to not just process what they've heard, but also processing in terms of them being able to plan their answer, because there's a lot more involved in that organisation and perhaps internal rehearsal before they have a go at saying their answer.
And they do tend to also need a lot more repetition when learning. So this might be outside of the classroom to really get to grips with what's being taught. That tends to be something that's needed as well.
Yeah. Can also have difficulties with attention and concentration. And again, it's like Hannah says, once you have a difficulty in one particular area, you start to then get kind of knock-on effects in surrounding areas. Surrounding areas in terms of how the brain functions, but also in terms of kind of what's going on physically in the environment at the time. And it can be difficult to attend and concentrate if you're struggling to understand and kind of process and kind of the speed of things that are going on, and also if things like your social skills and your friendships have started to be affected, and it can be less motivating to attend and concentrate in those social situations too.
Yeah, I think if a child's really struggling to work out what they're trying to say in their mind, then perhaps if a teacher's moving on with something, to be able to keep up with that, or to know where to focus their attention and switch between different competing pieces of information can be quite challenging. And it's very easy for children to lose track of their thoughts, particularly for writing. We talked about the sequencing and the difficulties there. And if they're trying to hold it in their head and then something else happens around them, it can just be a small little thing, but it's enough just to sort of make it disappear, and then they have to start again. And it can be quite frustrating and tiring for a child.
Absolutely. So, and then these final 3 points. So, pretty much as a result of all those other things that we've mentioned, whether your child's just got a verbal dyspraxia or they've got some of those other co-occurring difficulties as well. If it's not supported well, and we're not saying it's always not supported well, and we're going to talk about lots of ways in which we can help. But if it's not addressed, then inevitably you start to get low confidence and self-esteem, high anxiety. Lessons can become quite stressful, and
what we know about
lots of frustration.
Yeah, and what we know about anxiety and stress is that it impacts on concentration and memory. So if a child is feeling anxious because of their verbal dyspraxia, that it's going to make it even harder for them to concentrate and use their memory skills, which they already probably have difficulty with. What I would like to sort of add here when we're talking about emotions is that often children show how they're feeling through their behaviours. So if a child has behaviour difficulties at school and they've got verbal dyspraxia, it's important that we try to help everybody around the child and the child to understand that those behaviours are not about the child being naughty. They are communicating how they're feeling, they're communicating their anxieties or their stress and frustrations, or perhaps they're showing certain behaviours as a way of coping with their emotions. Something else that's worth noting is that sometimes children can mask their difficulties at school. So if your child has verbal dyspraxia, for example, but is really quite intelligent, and maybe they're not on the severe end of the dyspraxia scale, then they might be able to manage and cope and mask a lot of their issues at school, but then they let it all out at home. And this is where sometimes we can have difficulties with schools not really sort of seeing and understanding what's going on. And what we need them to do is to understand a child's issues and the causes of their difficulties, so that they're addressed appropriately, rather than trying to just address the behaviours at the surface level.
Absolutely, and that's so important.
Yeah, and we put fatigue on here as well, because this is something that I come across so much, and I really think is often overlooked, that when a child has a specific learning difficulty of any sort, they have to work so much harder than the other children in their class to keep up and to achieve, and it's exhausting. And I really don't think that often adults really understand, especially if a child doesn't show it in behaviour difficulties. It's something that's quite often overlooked, quite how exhausted they are all the time.
Absolutely, and that's quite a challenging one for us to get our head around, because often the first kind of thoughts around how to support children with a specific difficulty like this is to actually, is to give them more, and to they kind of get extra support and even more focus on them. They're kind of either taken out for like an individual session or a small group where they can't kind of hide away and have those little breaks that perhaps they just need because they're exhausted. So it's quite a difficult one.
Yeah, it's getting that balance right.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
So we're just going to pause here and in the middle before we move on to talking about some of the things you can do to help. So I know that we've had some questions come through, and I think we'll just take a look at those and see if there's some that we can answer for you now. But Karen, do you want to talk a little bit about the book that you've written? We hope you don't mind us sharing these with you. We've been developing resources and we're passionate in wanting to help children with difficulties and share our experience and our knowledge of what you can do to help your child. So we just wanted to take a couple of moments to share with you some of the things we've been working on.
Yeah, so I've got a book out, and it's actually on one of those kind of co-occurring difficulties, so autism and childhood aphaxia of speech, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just another term for verbal dyspraxia. And so in this book, I can document the journeys of several children. They're all based on real cases and real children that I've worked with, who have had a diagnosis of autism, and at the beginning of their kind of journey, if you like, with speech and language, they have been pre-verbal, and quite often with autism and children who are pre-verbal, there's kind of an assumption that they're pre-verbal because they have autism. But what's unique about some of these children with autism who are pre-verbal is that they've got that desire to speak, and they've got the intent in their communication, actually, wanting to communicate, and they're wanting to communicate verbally, but they have additional difficulties, very specific difficulties with the coordination of their muscles for speech, and so they will also then have verbal dyspraxia on top. So I talk about where those kind of two conditions meet, so where we've got autism and verbal dyspraxia, and kind of some of the techniques. So there's quite a lot of practical ideas within the book. So there's a bit of research at the beginning, and then there's the stories, and then I kind of give lots of practical tips in there. So if that was of interest, it is available. It's on Amazon. And then the other thing, just to point out, is that we're live on Hannah's Educational Psychology page at the moment. I've also got a page here on Facebook at Karen Massey Therapies, and within that there's also a group, a private group for parents and carers if you wanted to join a group for a little bit more ongoing support. And I've also been developing some online training courses. They're just not available yet. But Hannah has some exciting news about hers.
Yeah, I have some exciting news. So I've just been taking a look at the questions as well. So there's some really interesting questions come up, which we'll answer in just a second. But I've not been able to work during lockdown. So I've been busy developing online courses for parents and carers of children who have special educational needs. So many of my clients talk about difficulties helping their children with homework, and the frustrations and the tears and the tantrums, and it just becomes battle after battle. So for a while now, I wanted to put together some courses. They're really affordable, and the ones that will particularly interest a group of parents that are perhaps watching us today is the course on how to teach your child to read and spell. It's designed for children with dyslexia. So if your child has dyslexia as well, then do take a look. The link is there. It's called Send Bite Size. It's the website. And I'm in the process of developing more courses all the time. And there is also a free course on how to motivate and engage children with special educational needs when you're supporting them at home. So I know some families have used it during lockdown and found it really helpful. But even if when we get back to hopefully the new normal in September, if you're looking for ways to sort of engage and motivate your child when they're doing their homework and for it to be an easier experience, then do take a look. The courses have all been designed to overcome emotional barriers, and they use play and creativity in the activity programs to help you engage your child. But what's key is that you're taught about the psychology behind how children develop skills such as reading comprehension, spelling, and then there's a maths course that I'm about to release as well. And if you haven't come across my Facebook group yet, then the link is here. It's called Top Tips for Learning and Child Development, and you're very welcome to join. We have lots of information and freebies, and it's a fantastic resource base and a place where parents can ask any questions they like in relation to learning and child development. Karen, we've had a couple of interesting questions. There's one here that I'd like to just answer. That someone's asking about the difference between dyspraxia when it's acquired, so for example after a brain injury, as opposed to developmental. And essentially, any child who has a developmental condition, it's just about how they're born. It's about how their brain is wired. The difference is after an injury, pre-injury, there wasn't any kind of dyspraxia, any kind of verbal dyspraxia. But post-injury, the brain has been affected, it's been altered and changed because of the injury. Therefore, that person then has the difficulties with the speech development and language from that. And somebody's asking about the slides. Yes, they will be available afterwards, and we will be linking them on. Sorry, we forgot to mention that at the start.
Yeah, kind of launched straight in. I was just going to add about the acquired versus developmental. They kind of present very similarly. I tend to come across developmental because I I work only with children, and acquired dyspraxia will often be seen in adults. But because it's acquired and it's kind of a loss of previous skills that were intact, there can be cases where an adult who's got an acquired dyspraxia and perhaps any kind of associated difficulties has the potential to then to kind of regain those lost skills in a slightly different way. However, the way to kind of treat the speech problem as it presents would be very similar. One of the other questions that's come through is, what age would a child be diagnosed? The diagnosis of verbal dyspraxia is quite a tricky one, really, because it's about speech, and children who have, particularly if their dyspraxia is quite severe, it can mean that they are then much later to start talking, and perhaps might even be at the point where they're in school, or about to start school, and there's obviously lots of concern around how they're going to cope, and often we look to kind of what's wrong, is there a diagnosis that might help us to understand, and when a child's got really a limited amount of speech, it makes it harder to analyse that speech to know whether it's a verbal dyspraxia or whether it's another kind of speech difficulty. So there are other difficulties with speech which are not particularly about the muscles and difficulties with coordination, but they occur slightly higher up in the process. So it may be about how the sounds are being heard, and then how they're being understood and stored, and not necessarily about physical production. You'll notice I'm talking a lot and I'm not giving you a straight answer, but I'd say the earliest I would probably be fairly sure would possibly be around the age of 3. However, there's a lot of caution around that kind of age, because as I discussed when I was researching for my book, I've kind of read a lot of papers, and there can be a lot of potential for misdiagnosis. So in one study, they found that actually quite a high percentage of children who at age 3 were diagnosed with autism, when they were followed up kind of at a later point, they also met the criteria for verbal dyspraxia, and also vice versa. So children who were initially diagnosed with a verbal dyspraxia, then actually as time went on, and their presentation became clearer, they also met the criteria for autism. So it's easier to make a diagnosis if a child's got more speech that can be analysed for all the different difficulties, and it can be harder, and it can take some time, and it can be quite a bit later for somebody to be confident enough to make that diagnosis of verbal dyspraxia if a child's speech is more severely affected.
Okay, shall we move on?
Yes, let's move on. Okay, so I think this is mine to take, is it, Hannah?
Yes, please do.
Yes. Okay, so we're looking at first how to support your child at home, and we're thinking that this perhaps is even more relevant at the moment. Obviously, we're kind of in summer holiday mode, although it may not seem much different for some of you who've had your child at home for the last few months. But supporting a child at home with a verbal dyspraxia, I'm going to talk about things that kind of map onto the difficulties that we've described. So one approach would be colourful semantics. Colourful semantics is this image here. It's a colour-coded way of breaking down sentences into their smaller parts. It's a visual approach, which we mentioned is often easier for a child with verbal dyspraxia to learn through visual means rather than through listening and speaking. And it's a way that they can build sentences and demonstrate that they're able to use language in sentences using pictures, symbols, or words if they're able to use words, if they can read or they can write, which bypasses the need for speaking. So colourful semantics is a good one. You might want to, when looking at reading approaches, you might discover that your child is better with whole word reading rather than pursuing so much of a kind of phonics approach. They may find phonics quite challenging, particularly when there's difficulty with sequencing sounds, you know, and perhaps with blending. So whole word reading can be an easier way to support reading. And there are different programs out there, as well as you know, having a look on Hannah's training. Lots of repetition and drills. So with a verbal dyspraxia, there's no quick fix. Any kind of therapy will rely on lots and lots of practice, and so, you know, drilling. There's, you know, just have to keep repeating in order to set the pattern and kind of get it embedded when a child is able to say any word or phrase that they've been practicing. And it's best to be done little and often. So NDP3, that refers to the Nuffield Dyspraxia Programme, and it's the 3rd edition. So I've got, I'm going to show up. So here I've got kind of my copy of the assessment booklets there. And it's the reason why I like this programme, it's very evidence-based. That it takes speech and it breaks it down into really small steps, and it's a visual program that can be followed step by step. Support self-esteem. I think it was a parent who commented that actually, if you can do everything you can to support a child's self-esteem, possibly regardless of the difficulty, that's the most important thing you can do, because giving them that extra confidence, that they're good at things, and it kind of highlighting the things that they can do rather than focus on their speech, which they find difficult, will motivate them, and they're likely to then kind of move forwards and do better as a result. You might want to look at activities that promote coordination in general, so physical activities, which may not seem particularly linked to speech, but will help with just that general coordination. So things like swimming and playing the piano, where you've got to coordinate different parts of your brain and make those links that we talked about. Working with the strengths and the learning styles and not against them. And this is something that I'm seeing, I've seen in quite a few places recently, and I completely agree with. So it's about not focusing on the fact that speech is difficult, but thinking about, okay, well, what are they good at, and how can we support learning in a different way? You know, so such as the colourful semantics approach above. If a child's speech is really quite difficult to understand, and their dyspraxia is quite severe, then consider supporting with AAC, which stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. So AAC could be using signing, so Makaton or sign along. AAC can be using symbols, so your child might use a system such as PECS, or symbol mats like Pod. They might use a high-tech device. So there are more and more readily available, and they're getting cheaper, kind of speech apps that you can buy. And I would always advocate use of AAC. People can be a little bit wary of it because they think it may hold their child's speech back, but actually that's really not likely to happen at all. And in fact, it's actually more likely to help speech develop. But at the same time, you're allowing the child to communicate, and so the frustration is going to be much more reduced. So that's important to consider. Other people have found benefit from use of rhyme and singing. Singing, you know, you read about it with people who stammer as well, don't you? How singing is somehow easier than speaking. And there's a few parents who had commented how they find that singing helps. And finally, just having the right support and a supportive team. It can be a lonely journey, having a child with verbal dyspraxia. You know, you might find that people who you know, perhaps family members, perhaps friends, have never heard of it. They don't really know what it is, and therefore might find it more difficult to understand and know that you need support with it. And having a supportive team, so not just friends and family, but any professionals who are involved, people at school, because you're going to need it, because the journey could be quite long. It can take a long time to get the speech improved through therapy.
Okay, so thank you, Karen. That's brilliant. Actually, really interesting for me as well to hear in more depth the sort of ways that families can support children at home. And I know it's a lot of the work that you do with families too. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do to help your child in relation to their difficulties at school. So if we start off thinking about homework, there's often, I think, a pressure that parents feel that they've got to get their child to do the home learning. Home learning should be about practicing and rehearsing something that your child is already familiar with. So I always say to my clients, don't try to be the teacher. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Your job is to give your child opportunities to practice and just to support and encourage them. And something you can focus on with them is developing their memory skills, because this will help them in all aspects of their learning. So, for example, doing lots of games that involve visual memory, so playing like pairs matching games and things like that. We know that children with verbal dyspraxia tend to learn better through visual methods, so being able to really build on their strengths and develop their visual memory skills is going to help them. Thinking about categorizing, what we talked earlier about making links between different words and what they mean. So to start off by being able to categorize that, lion, elephant and monkey are all types of animals, and then being able to move on to relate words in a more abstract sense. So knowing that the word blue, for example, is not only a colour and the colour of the sky, but also is a word that can be used to describe how somebody is feeling. So games such as categories are great for helping children with categorising, if your child's a bit older. And the other thing to think about is, I'll come back to home learning choices, but when we're doing these activities with our children, whether it's helping them to develop an aspect of memory or the way they learn, or it's helping them with their actual homework, is to try and think about using multi-sensory learning. So this is where you're providing an opportunity for your child to explore and learn about something using different senses, because we know that this helps make stronger connections in the brain, and makes it easier for a child to learn and recall information later on if they've been able to learn it through making links with how they see, what they're hearing, touching, smelling even. So that's really important to think about. And another little tip for homework is to give your child a choice of activities. Often children with a specific difficulty can feel really out of control, because everything around them is chaotic and it's overwhelming. So being able to give your child a choice for the small things to start off with, giving them a sense of control right from the get-go, can help. So, for example, do you want to do some reading or some maths tonight? Do you want to do this activity or that? Let's think a little bit now about your relationship with the school and how you might communicate with school when there is an issue and you're not happy with either with how your child's being supportive, or perhaps you're just worried about your child and are not really sure what to say or what you can and can't say, and how to go about things. So the first thing I would really recommend doing is focus on trying to build positive relationships with school staff, because if you have somebody that you feel you can trust and that you're comfortable talking with, it's going to make all those difficult conversations much easier. I always say to try and approach conversations with a view of, I'd like to understand. So rather than going in with a lot of anger and frustration, which you may well feel, and that's absolutely fine to feel that way, it's not unfortunately going to be very productive in a conversation with school about trying to support your child's needs. So we need to try and put those feelings aside and go in with the idea of I just want to have a conversation. I'd like to try and understand about what you can do at school to help my child. It's a good starting point, because even if you don't feel you get very far, you may just start to plant those seeds, and the member of staff may start to think a little bit more about, well, what is verbal dyspraxia, and actually how is it affecting the child in my classroom, because the majority of teachers, they do care and they do really want to help. They might just not really know about a particular condition, or they might feel actually they're a bit constrained in terms of resources within the school. It's always okay to ask questions. I'm always amazed at the number of questions that I get asked, which I'm always very happy to answer, but I always think to myself, it's quite sad that parents don't feel comfortable or know that they've got permission to be able to ask a teacher or even other professionals the questions that are on their mind. Please ask lots and lots of questions. It's really okay to do that. Some of the questions you might like to ask that can sort of help those conversations and start everybody thinking more about ways to move forward in supporting your child. Questions such as, how are you educating all the staff in the school? Is there any training going on? How are my child's needs communicated between staff? What about other children? Are there any conversations or particular programs they're putting in place to support other children know about verbal dyspraxia and how to respond to a friend that has verbal dyspraxia? Are there any technological aids or scribes available to help your child? Another interesting one is, how does the SENCO, the inclusion coordinator, how do they communicate your child's strengths as well? It's not just about the difficulties, because if we can also focus on what works really well for your child, that's a great place to start building on. And often it's easier to find ways forward when we start with what we know works well. How do teachers differentiate assessment? Okay, so this is quite an interesting one. I was thinking about this. Verbal dyspraxia is quite restrictive for a child sometimes, and be able to show their knowledge, particularly if they've got no issues with intelligence. So an interesting question to maybe ask the teacher or the SENCO is, how are they adapting their assessment processes to enable them to get a really true picture of your child's knowledge and skills? If we can bypass those verbal difficulties, to find out, for example, their knowledge of history, what have they got in place, or what can they try? Are there any whole class interventions that are in place? There's lots that can be done to help individual children that are done at a whole class level. So it doesn't have to be always about finding extra money and extra time and extra people power. If it's about vocabulary, for example, all children will benefit from a bit of pre-teaching on key maths vocabulary or science vocabulary. And then in terms of thinking about how to help with any emotional issues or behaviour issues, something that's really important for this is thinking about communication. So we need to find creative ways to help your child communicate when they're not happy about something or they don't understand something. But this needs to be something that's agreed with everybody, with your child, the teacher, yourselves. So having those conversations with the teacher and thinking about what can we do so that my child can let you know if there's something they're struggling with is really important. And it's not necessarily going to be the classic put your hand up and tell the teacher, because they're probably not going to feel very confident to do that, and then they're going to struggle maybe to get their words out anyway. So we might be thinking more about colour coding or visual system for that. Okay, thinking about preparing in advance at home. So there's things that you can do yourself at home to prepare for conversations with school and think about how you might address any issues. So the first place to start is to know what your school offers, to get copies of their special education needs offer. Every school has to have one on their website. So you've got a starting point to know what the schools say they will put in place. Another suggestion is to ask other parents for support. So I'm going to share a little anecdote here from something I did in relation to my son that may be helpful if your child is having social difficulties. Maybe the other children don't really understand, don't know how to respond, maybe they're being teased. So my son has Tourette's, and he went through a phase where he was ticking quite a lot at school, and some of the other children started to notice and copy in sort of a mimicking way. They weren't being cruel, they were just being kids. And my son really didn't want a big deal made of it. He didn't want a whole big class discussion. So what we agreed was that I would send a message out to the parents on our, I think it was the Facebook group, it might be a WhatsApp group, and all I did was I explained what his condition was, and I explained what helps him and what other children can do to be a good friend. And basically with Tourette's, it's just to ignore. But for verbal dyspraxia, what can other children do to respond, to help if your child is struggling? And just to pop it down without any kind of accusations or anger, just very matter-of-factly asking for a bit of support. You'll probably be really surprised about how supportive the parents are. They all went away and had a little quiet chat with their own child, and all the mimicking stopped at school. So perhaps you want to ask other parents, just to let their children know that your child may need more time, and this is why they may struggle to get their words out, and why it might not make sense sometimes, and that it's okay to say, well, actually, could you just explain, I didn't quite understand that, all those sorts of things. It's something that might help. Issues at playtime are a big deal for children with verbal dyspraxia at school, and we have lots of playtimes, and they can be quite overwhelming. They can cause a lot of anxiety, and we can get into lots of problems. So something you can do with your child at home is to practice some script that they can use when they're talking and interacting with other children. That if they don't understand something, if they disagree, if they need help, if they're not happy, some simple short sentences that they can practice using. And if your child is non-verbal, perhaps choosing which symbols they may have on them that they might show the other children. Just let them know if there's something that they're not understanding or they're not happy about. So practicing at home. This extends to pre-teaching vocabulary, key concepts. If you know what's going to be focused on in school, if you don't ask, teachers are usually more than happy to let you know roughly the themes that are going to be focused on in different topics and different subjects. And again, pre-teach vocabulary. Give your child opportunities to watch videos in relation to particular topics if you're doing the Fire of London or whatever, as much as they can do before, so when they go into class they're familiar with it and they're better able to make sense of what's being taught. Learning names is a tricky one for children with verbal dyspraxia. Sometimes being able to remember other children's names, and something you can do at home, and Karen may have some suggestions as well, but is to think about how you can make visual associations with a particular child. So you might have the class photos, photo of all the children in the class up, and then you might sort of think about maybe a place that your child has been with that child and put a little symbol. Maybe went to the park together, so you have a picture of a swing, or maybe there's something particular about that child that they always wear a pink coat, and so you have that next to that child to help them just start to make more connections with the child's name as well. I don't know, Karen, if you've got anything you want to add to that about remembering names. Tricky one.
Using different ways to different associations is a really good one. A way that children in a class where perhaps quite a number of the children, so perhaps in a special education school where a number of the children have different communication difficulties, would be to have a signed name as well as a spoken name. So often it would be having the sign for the first letter of the name. To start with, if you've got more than one child whose name begins with that letter, well, that sound, then you kind of need to add a second element. So it could be, if you've got two Georges, they might both be G, but one might be George with glasses and one might be George with curly hair, for example. And so they would have two signs to represent the two parts. And just learning one sign can be a lot easier than sequencing a lot of sounds, put them together and make them understood. And children will often enjoy, so in a mainstream classroom, even if your child is the only child who has a communication difficulty, often other children will really enjoy learning a little bit of signing. So if signing is something that your child does respond to, either to understand or in terms of using sign, it can be a really fun activity for all the children in the class. To learn a few things, and names of peers is really important, isn't it?
Something else I've put down here is to praise your child for being brave, because they go through so much and they are so resilient and they overcome so many hurdles. And at the core of that is that they're being really brave, even when they're finding it really hard, even when they don't want to go to school or they're struggling. The small steps that they take, whether it is actually just getting to school, or whether it's just being able to let you know that they're not happy about something in school. The fact that they're trying to overcome their difficulties and working so hard every day, that's really, really brave, and it's something that we need to celebrate with them. It can help to develop your child's emotional literacy, because if they can learn to recognise and understand their emotions, and then learn safe ways to express and cope with their emotions, that's going to help them at school when they're feeling those frustrations because of their language difficulties. What I would say is that emotional literacy is a whole other topic in itself, but for children with verbal dyspraxia, just bear in mind that you would need to adapt perhaps how they're learning about emotions using visual methods. And then the last thing here is just to say that don't be afraid to share your knowledge with the school. They're experts in teaching, but you're experts in your child. And the majority of parents that I know whose children have verbal dyspraxia very quickly acquire a lot of knowledge. And Karen and I were saying at the start of this that actually we hope we're going to be able to give you something useful, because actually you already know so much. But don't be afraid to share your knowledge with the school. Most teachers, we find it really, really helpful. And we're actually going to, there's a really fantastic leaflet I found that I think it was the Aphasic charity website, that I will attach in the comments afterwards, because it's a leaflet that was developed by a school, but you could just copy it out and share it with your school, and they might even want to just adapt it with their school logo on it. I thought it was really nicely laid out, so it's a nice thing that you can pass on. And then my last tip, if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to think about ways in which you can give your child a voice, because obviously they struggle with their language, and they've got a lot going on for them, and really they're not necessarily going to be able to, or even want to, go up to the teacher and say, look, I'm not happy about this, and this is what I need to help. So what can be really helpful is to arrange a meeting with you and your child, and maybe just their teacher, maybe the SENC as well, but not too many adults. And the purpose of the meeting is just to get your child's perspective on their experiences of being at school, their experiences of learning. And I just wanted to give you some suggestions about the way you can help make that happen. So the first premise of the discussion is that there's no right or wrong. It's just about getting your child's views, and you need to reassure them of that. We need to avoid abstract questions. So sometimes when we meet with teachers at school and the child as well, we want to avoid questions like why, and things that are sort of going to be hard for your child to understand, but also they might then struggle to sort of formulate an answer. So we can use visuals to help your child to understand and communicate. So for example, you might want to give them a happy and a sad face, and then you might want to show pictures or say the different places in a school, like the rooms, the different people in school, so groups of children or teachers, and give your child a happy and a sad face, and how do those places and those interactions make your child feel. Another lovely question is, if you could make magic, what would you change at school? So rather than, what's going well, and tell me what needs to be, what are we doing wrong, what needs to be better. They're tough questions for a child, but something like, if you could make magic, use your imagination a little bit, what would you change? Another one for likes and dislikes is if you can maybe put pictures of different aspects of school life. So maybe it's school work, or an adult working with you in a group, or being on the playground. And get your child to sort of visually sort those pictures into a pile of likes and dislikes. And it's a good starting point then to help you understand what your child's experiencing, help the teachers sort of get insight into their perspective and experience. And then also you can put feeling faces. So beyond happy and sad, you can put faces that show anger and frustration and excitement. And then perhaps your child can put the faces next to the different pictures as well. So you can start to think about how your child's feeling at school. They can feel heard, which is often something that the children really, particularly if they've got verbal dyspraxia, they might not really feel very heard because they can't just talk about feelings in necessarily in the way that other children can. And then it's a great starting point for moving forward in your discussions with the school about what they can do to help.
Fantastic. Some really, really lovely ideas there, Hannah. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. You know, kind of through all that is, I know one of my last comments on my slide was you've got to have the supportive team, and it's important to remember that everybody around your child is there to see your child do the best that your child can. So kind of having those positive relationships and supporting everybody, you know, everybody's got their area of expertise. Like you say, you know, the teacher is an expert in teaching, you're an expert in parenting your child, and your child is an expert in knowing what they like and don't like, and it's kind of valuing everybody's opinion and filling in the gaps when people don't have the information that they need. And that's just helpful. So when the support is right, what happens? You know, we talked at the beginning about all the difficulties, but we want to kind of finish on a positive. So a couple of lovely quotations from people who have been helped, and they've got verbal dyspraxia, but they've had the right help. And one person said that when he started to have therapy for his speech, he felt like the therapist was pulling words out of his brain, and really like that kind of image that conjures up. It's like all those words were there, and it was just teasing them out, and it was finally he was able to say what he wanted. The second, having more confidence in talking to others and improved speech sound. So yes, about physically having clearer speech, but also the confidence that gives you to talk to other people and kind of extend your social network. And finally, this is somebody called Colin Jost, who's written about his experiences recently, and he said it was a profound sense of relief. So, you know, we can get the support right, we can get it in place, and we can help these children to make progress. And when we do, it's really worth it. So, I'm conscious we've gone over time. We did say we had a lot to get through, and apologies if we've not kind of fully explored any questions or comments, but hopefully we can come back to those. So if you have commented or if you left a question, we'll be able to go back through. And we've got that leaflet, as Hannah said, that we'll put up, so it's got some really great ideas. And here is just a list. Again, the slides will be available, so you'll have this. You don't need to take notes now, but we've got quite a few links here, different places you can explore about technology, different websites to find out more information about some of the approaches, one about apps, there's a link to my book, and the leaflets.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic hour. I've loved talking about verbal dyspraxia and learning. It's been great chatting with you as well, Karen, and I hope everyone has found it really useful. If you've got any questions, you can comment now. If you're watching this at a later time, still comment, and we will be going through the next few days and coming back and answering as many questions as we can. We look forward to doing a few more of these maybe in the future.
Absolutely. So just to say again, I've kind of been having a look, and I just want to mention Hannah's SEN bite-sized courses, obviously, but and hopefully we're going to be doing some more of these. We've definitely got an idea for another one, perhaps next month, which we will share together as well. But it's just to highlight that we are putting things out there as well. So do look out for the other resources too. And thanks once again for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.